Lion Den Gorge Nature Preserve is one of the most striking places in Ozaukee County. It stretches across bluffs, wetlands, cedar forests, and a long stretch of Lake Michigan shoreline in Grafton, Wisconsin. The county described it as one of the last undeveloped pieces of shoreline in the area, and when you stand here, it's easy to see why. The views are beautiful, the air feels different, and the land seems quiet. But that quiet also says something else. There's no marker, no plaque, and no clear acknowledgement of the indigenous people who lived here and cared for this land long before it became a county preserve. And that silence is what this video is about. When I dropped a pin on Lion Den Gorge in Native Land Digital, I saw multiple indigenous nations connected to this area, including Menominee, Ho-Chunk, and Potawatomi territory. But I also saw something else, Secession 160, that labels a point to the Treaty of Washington, signed on February 8, 1831, when Menominee ceded about 2.5 million acres of land to the United States. And that means that the ground under this preserve is connected to a much larger story of removal and loss. Chief Oshkosh did not attend the negotiations, and the treaty was later contested, but the land was still taken from the people who had lived here for generations. The signs here focus on the trails, the birds, and the bluffs, and the boardwalks. They point out the natural beauty of the preserve, and they do an important job of explaining the landscape, but they leave out the deeper story. They do not tell you whose land this was before the European settlement. They do not name the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk, or the Potawatomi. They do not explain that the preserve sits within a history of treaty loss, displacement, and survival. Even some of the land physical landmarks tell part of the story. The bluff, the gorge, and the shoreline, and the wooden paths all shape how people move through this place today. But they are also part of a much older relationship between the land and the indigenous communities. The land itself still carries indigenous knowledge. While cedar grows throughout this preserve, and for many Anishinaabe people, it has long been a culturally important tree used for medicine, building, and ceremony. While cedar is not just a part of the scenery here, it is part of the living relationship between people and place. And the same is true of the other native plants in the forest, including spring wildflowers and maple trees that have supported foodways and seasonal practices for generations. But that history does not stand alone. In 1838, more than 850 Potawatomi people were forced on a 660-mile removal from Indiana to Kansas, in what is now remembered as the Trail of Death. Many of the people on the march were elders and children, and more than 40 died along the way. And some Potawatomi escaped north into Wisconsin, and their descendants are still here today. So when we walk about this land, we are not talking about the past that is over. We are talking about the history that still shapes the present. What stood out to me about the park signs is that it talks about trails, birds, bluffs, and conservations, but they do not mention the indigenous nations whose lands this was before the European settlements. Ozaukee County says the preserve was acquired in 2002 and protects a rare shoreline landscape, which is true, but the place can be protected and still be incomplete in the way it tells its story. Indigenizing Lion Den Gorge does not mean changing the trails or erasing the park. It means telling the full story. It means placing the signs at the entrance that names the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk, and the Potawatomi. It means acknowledging Secession 160 and the forced removals that followed, and acknowledging the history that the land carries. And it means adding indigenous language, plant knowledge, and tribal history to the way the land is interpreted.